So last night I began to read the book My People Shall Live by Leila Khaled, a revolutionary, a Palestinian revolutionary. I'm going to finish her autobiography, but before I finish, I want to put some crowdfund posts in the replies as well as provide the PDF in the Jumbotron. So those listening to the recording, you'll hear a brief pause. Just give me a couple minutes just to get everything situated, and then we'll get right back into the reading. What I want to do, or what I hope to do, is to finish her autobiography in one space, and that way people can listen to it in two parts. Which reminds me, I'll also put part one in the Jumbotron as well. So let me get on that. Also, too, if anyone has any crowdfund posts or any resources you would like to share, feel free to put them in the replies. It's all good. Okay, I have one more to put. Let's see. All right. And, oh, that's right, the PDF. So the book is now available in the space, and also the previous reading is also available too. So let me pull my copy up. And we're on section 2. Boom, there it is. Education and revolution. Oh, you know what? Let me grab something to drink. So, just once again, for the recording, we're reading My People Shall Live, an autobiography of Leila Khaled, a Palestinian revolutionary. This is section 2. Again, I put crowdfund post in the replies. If y'all can share and boost and support in every way possible. And then also too, there's the previous reading of the chapters in the Jumbotron. And then there's also the free PDF. Feel free to share so that anyone and everyone can have access to this. So I'll start. Education and revolution. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau. As a member of the Arab nationalist movement, I was trained to be conscious of the past, present, and future. Underdeveloped people and societies typically lack an awareness of the present and the future, but such consciousness is imperative if we are to be masters of our own lives and environment. We cannot overcome the past and its crippling ideologies unless we gain a free consciousness. Underdeveloped people live by fate. They look with nostalgia to a golden past. My people and I suffer from these debilities. But we are also living in the ongoing process of history and are trying to determine our future rather than bind ourselves to a dead past. The value of the conquest of Palestine by imperialism and Zionism is that it forced some of us to re-examine the foundation of our society on our own. We discovered that our society was rotten, traditional, unprogressive. Our defeat was indeed our salvation, our means of regeneration and renewal. Now, the issue is not restoration, but the construction of a new socialist republic encompassing the entire Arab world. We must either accept or decline the challenge. If we accept, we must head to the mountains, to the peasants' huts, to the city slums. If we decline, we could lead a life of quote unquote happy servitude under the yoke of Zionism and imperialism and compare our economic well being today with that of last year or the year before Zion liberated us. In quotes. Moreover, we could console ourselves by saying, we now have peace and quiet, and we have more quote unquote democracy under Zion and his bulldozers than under Hussein and his Bidon regiments. And for the recording, I'm mispronouncing a lot of these words because I'm unfamiliar with it. But anyone listening who knows better, don't hesitate to leave a message in my DMs. I do want to learn, and I would be very appreciative. By 1955, I was becoming conscious of present problems and future plans. In that spring, I obtained my elementary school certificate and made plans to go on to secondary school. I was 11 years old, and Israel was 7. We went through the same perennial ritual of denouncing Zionism, imperialism, and Arab reactionaries on the 7th anniversary of our exile and doing nothing about it. Meanwhile, Israel had used those 7 years to consolidate her internal front and integrate her Afro-Asian population, the Sephardim Jews. Peace overtures were made by Moshe Sharett in 1954, but his government was toppled by the Israeli Hawks under the redoubtable leadership of Ben-Gurion. However, before Sharett's overthrow, the Israeli government was implicated in one of the most insidious plots in the history of diplomacy. The scheme, known as the Lavon Affair, entailed the blowing up of the U.S. and British embassies under other Western strategic interests in Egypt to prove the instability of the Egyptian regime and persuade Israel's protectors to remain inconstant at Suez and not to withdraw from the Sudan. The Israeli, of course, had hoped to make the crime appear to work of, had hoped to make the crime appear the work of the Egyptians. Sorry about that. Got tongue-tied. Unhappily for them, they were caught red-handed and exposed. The Lavon Affair rocked Israeli politics for the next decade. Israeli expansionism began in earnest with the gradual annexation of demilitarized zones set up under the truce agreements of Rhodes, 1949. The continued expulsion of Arabs from Israel and the suppression of the remaining Arab minority in Israel. More important was the start of the policy of massive reprisals. This was launched on October 15th, 1953, with an attack on the village of Kibbutz and culminated in February 28, 1955, when Israel invaded the Gaza Strip, demolished Egyptian fortification, and killed and wounded over 150 people. The attack did not have its intended effect. Nasir did not withdraw. Instead, he encompassed the entire Arab world. By the autumn of 1955, he concluded the famous arms deal with Czechoslovakia, thereby breaking the Western monopoly as sole armament supplier to the Mideast states, and began to move towards Pan-Arabism. Everything crystallized in the early autumn of 1955 because Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA and brother of John Foster Dulles, flew to Cairo in September and tried to persuade President Nasser not to go through with the Czechs arms deal. Hold on real quick. I hope y'all can hear me, but let me just double check and make sure. Everything crystallized in the early autumn of 1955 because Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA and brother of John Foster Dulles, flew to Cairo in September and tried to persuade President Nasser not to go through with the Czechs arms deal. Perfect. Thank you. This high-handed gesture, denounced by Arab nationalists, was only the first in a series of attempts on the part of the American imperialists to undermine Nasser. Hardly any school child that year escaped learning about these events. I anxiously absorbed details and mastered most of the anti-Western arguments. My family's economic condition was improved and the atmosphere around the house relaxed. We now had a 3-room apartment, and hunger was no longer a threat. 2 of my sisters were working, and mother had made some wise investments. We all felt that the Arabs were taking some overdue first steps towards recovering Palestine, and we were still wholeheartedly behind the nationalist movement. 1956 was the year of years in modern Arab history. The Nasserite regime, aided by external and internal pressures, had managed to extract an excavation agreement from the British in 1954, and by June 1956, withdrawal was completed. Dulles and Eaton then decided to topple Nasser because he was moving in a neutralist direction instead of towing the Western line. They exerted economic pressures, but he did not yield. Nasser was beginning to sense his potential power and the desire of the Arab masses for a strong, charismatic leader. Eaton and Dulles, of their part, were unable to grasp the profound changes that were taking place. They thought that if they couldn't overthrow Nasser, they could humiliate him and make waves by withdrawing the promised $70 million loan for the Aswan High Dam project. Nasser responded by nationalizing the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956. The Arab giant had suddenly awakened and roared with fury at the West. Mass adulation for Nasser became an Arab phenomenon. Nasserism became a worldwide doctrine. The West was stunned when Arab pilots soon proved that they could operate the canal just as, if not more, competently than their Western counterparts. The world stopped and listened. Diplomats from the Third World made pilgrimage to Cairo to declare their solidarity with the Arabs. When Robert Menzies, the Prime Minister of Australia, journeyed to Cairo carrying the ultimatum of the Canal Users Association, Nasser gave Menzies an emphatic no and sent him packing. Emphatic no and sent him packing. The Arab world applauded. The oppressed saw a spark of hope. Europe and America stood in awe while Nasser became the brown giant of the Third World. Then came the infamous tripartite invasion of Egypt on October 29, 1956, but Nasser held on to the canal and the reins of power. Israel had unabashedly conspired with Britain and France to reverse the tide of Arab history and impose a new imperial regime on our world. The 1956 invasion of Egypt ceased on November 6. That day, a new baby was born in the Khaled family. We called him Nasser in honor of President Nasser, to symbolize our first hour of victory since the defeat of 1948. Nasser was number 12 and the last child of Ali Khaled. Now the family could either form a soccer team or take on the 12 tribes of Israel. The decision was already made. The autumn was the most exciting period of my childhood. We were engaged in all sorts of feverish activities. It seemed as if the whole school was one family. The whole of Sahara was one tribe. The whole of the Arab world was one nation state. It was a time to remember and enjoy, a time of pride and self-confidence. But the enemy was still at the gates. The years from 1956 to 1959 were my period of political apprenticeship as an activist. Although I had sensed intense political interest and activity in our house since 1954, I somehow did not grasp its full significance and was not really involved in the discussions. Brother Muhammad was a member of the Arab nationalist movement, and he frequently gave us literature to distribute in Sahara or posters to paste up. Sisters Sakaya and Rahab, I hope. Most have joined the movement in 1956 or 1957, and they were very active. I began to associate with the movement people in 1957. I didn't realize, however, how much more there was to the movement than writing and distributing pamphlets, demonstrating or making speeches. The movement was active in 1957 when it was widely rumored that Turkey was planning to invade Syria and overthrow the progressive regime on behalf of the U.S. We had numerous discussions, but there was no organized youth movement to take action. I was on the periphery and asked my sisters for information which they refused to give because I was not a fully fledged member of the movement. But my enthusiasm at associating with liberationists and my emotional commitment to the cause offset any misgivings I might have had about not being a participating member. In 1958, under artillery fire from the Lebanese army, the distinction between member and non-member ceased. Saur was under siege. The false friends of Palestine and Arabism began to show their teeth immediately after the formation of the United Arab Republic in February 1958. To protect their own tottering regimes, the Hashemites of Iraq and Jordan formed their own counter-federation, probably under Western instigation. The whole Arab world was polarized. Pan-Arabism versus provincial sovereignties, revolution versus counter-revolution, Cairo versus Baghdad. In this political context, sorry about that. In this political context, the Lebanese president, Chauman, the darling of Western diplomats, decided to seek a second presidential term. The Arab nationalist movement, as well as other forces, progressive and reactionary, sought to block the constitutional amendment proposed by his party. Because of the constitutional deadlock, the conflict of antagonistic social forces, and the opportunism of merchants and politicians on both sides, a civil war erupted on May 10th, 2 days after the assassination of Nasib al-Matini, a renowned Arab political editor. In Saur, local opposition to the Arab nationalist movement was feeble. It was easy for us to seize the city and run its government in the interest of the people and the rebellion. The island of Saur proper was under our absolute control. But the army held the gate at the northern end of town, where the opposition had numerous followers, including the local member of parliament, his tribe, and clients. Tempers in Saur had been running high since April 2nd, 1958, when the gendarmerie has shot and killed Man Halawa, and I apologize for mispronouncing these completely wrong, a prominent nationalist leader. Most people in Saur considered his murder unwarranted and unprovoked. The Solidarity Club of Saur, however, interrupted Halawa's murder as a declaration of war on the Arab nationalist movement, as well as an attempt by the Lebanese authorities to intimidate the city and foil the nationalists. Their premonitions proved correct. A 3-day curfew was imposed, followed by a roundup of political agitators. When the people discovered what was happening, they broke the curfew, stormed the police station, and released the prisoners. This time, Mohammed Qasim, another distinguished nationalist, was killed, and I had my first brush with death, escaping by only a few centimeters. Although I had participated in practically every demonstration in Saur for the past 6 years, 1952 until April 1958, it seemed like just a lot of fun. I had not seen anyone murdered since the man who died in front of our house in Haifa, when I had been safely hidden under the staircase. Ma'an Halawa, however, was gunned down by the Lebanese gendarmes while shouting nationalist slogans as he was raised shoulder high by comrades. Muhammad Qasim was shot when this is a word I'm not familiar with, so I'm going to spell it out, and anyone who knows it, please tell me. It's Gendarmes. So I'm going to pronounce it gendarmes. The gendarmes tried to reimpose their curfew on Saur. I was by his side, handing him stones to hurl at the gendarmes when he was cut down. I ran screaming for help. When help came, he was still alive, and we rushed him to the hospital in a broken old car. I thought he was going to live. The surgeon came out of the operating room after a few minutes. He walked slowly towards us, then solemnly offered his condolences, trying to hide his own tears. For the first time in my life, I knew the loss of a comrade in battle. I cried for days. The city mourned the loss of 2 great comrades and gave them heroes' funerals. But that was only the beginning. The summer of 1958 was a summer of mournings. The paramilitary forces and the army of Chauman advanced like a pack of mercenaries to ravage our city and bring us the blessings of American weaponry. That summer, I do not remember sleeping a whole night without interruption, for I was a soldier at 13, and I had sentinel duty and other political and military obligations. I was anxious to be a good soldier. As the Lebanese divided and brother killed brother, it became evident that too many foreign fingers were on the triggers. On July 16th, 1958, American Marines landed in Lebanon 2 days after the Iraqi people overthrew the Hashemite dynasty there and executed Nuri al-Said and Abdullah, Britain's most faithful Arab agents. The Lebanese Arab people witnessed the awesome majesty of the Sixth Fleet. Unhappily, however, for America, it was too late to restore Nuri and company to power, but they stayed in Lebanon, deadlocked the civil war, and declared it a draw. Arab political commentators wrote books on neither victorious nor vanquished. Fortunately, the summer of 1958 in Saur was not as devastating as we had feared. The destruction was mitigated by an uneasy, unwritten local accord with the army. The ANM controlled the town center. The army held the outskirts of the city. The continuous bombardment of our positions was nerve-wracking and frightening. In addition, the army frequently cut off food supplies, but we improvised and managed. At one stage, our area was being starved and our men's morale was weakening because of the bombardment of the army and their own hunger. We had about 10 kilos of flour at home, and I decided that I could bake enough bread for the men. But instead of baking it, I kneaded the entire 10 kilos and fried the dough in olive oil. Now, I could supply a regiment, not only a few dozen fighters. The image of a revolutionary Jesus blessing the fish and feeding the multitudes came to mind, but I performed no miracles. The crucial part came when I delivered the bread to the lions. I was caught in the crossfire of the two sides. Each thought I was the enemy, but apparently neither was prepared to gun me down. I was amazed by the speed of the bullets as they buzzed by, and was somehow surprised to see a real battle scene raging, particularly with me in the midst. Until then, I had thought that battles were like demonstrations. I quickly learned about battles and screamed to both sides to stop fighting because I only had bread on my tray, which I carried on top of my head as befits a Palestinian maiden. Fortunately, one of the comrades recognized me and signaled to his men to stop firing. I ran in his direction, and when he called my name and reached the hungry men safely. Later, I learned another lesson of war. I was ready to choke any Lebanese soldier I could lay my hands on when one day a soldier walked into our house asking for a drink of water. I replied that I'd give him a drink of poison before I'd give him a drink of water. He seemed taken aback. "Why would you do such a thing?" he asked. I said, "Because you're murdering our men." He smiled and cautiously replied, "Miss, if we had been aiming our bombardment on your men in the city, the whole thing would have gone up in smoke by now. We have orders to fire, and we are firing, but we are not aiming. We merely fire to keep our men edgy and in place, hoping that they won't try to attack us or attempt to cross to our side of town. Tell your comrades to stay put, otherwise we will be forced to wipe out the whole area." Mother and I listened carefully. I told him he was a liar, and he deserved to die of thirst and starvation as well. Mother relented and told me to give the soldier a drink in return for the good news he brought us. I reluctantly did so, insisting that he was an enemy soldier and he should be treated accordingly. "We should take him prisoner," I announced. He gestured at his gun as he stood in the doorway, clucking over my outrageous threats. He suggested that I try to attack his side of town if I were so courageous. Mother pleaded with him to tell his comrades not to fire so mercilessly on the city and men, and he in turn assured us that he was a Lebanese who loved his country and did not wish to see it destroyed. In 1958, having proved my mettle in battle, I had earned the right to candidate membership in the Arab nationalist movement. My mother strongly disapproved of the political activities of the girls in the family. She felt that now that the Civil War was over, the girls should stay at home and leave the politics to men. Mother had no objections to Brother Muhammad manning the trenches, staying out late at night, or going off on unknown political missions for weeks at a time. To her, Muhammad was a man, so he did the work of men. Such was her upbringing. She said she was also afraid of scandalous talk in the neighborhood about women in politics. Mother knew that the social ostracism would result if any one of us stepped out of line. My sisters assured her that they were mature and capable of looking after themselves. Besides, they said the men they associated with were respectful, political gentlemen with high principles. None was out to violate any girl, especially girl comrades. Nothing would convince Mother. Father was a little reluctant and suspicious, but he favored our position, and it was finally he and Muhammad who came to the rescue. They succeeded in persuading Mother not to disrupt the political work of my sisters. When we were kicked out of Palestine, they argued, Zionists did not distinguish between men and women. Women constituted over one half of the Palestinian people, and they too were exiled. The Israelis trained their women to fight and granted them civil liberties. If we wish to defeat the Israelis, we must outplay them in their own game. Mother was silenced by one final question. Do you wish to see Palestine liberated? Father asked. Yes, she said unhesitantly. Muhammad reasoned, Mother, you cannot then oppose the participation of your daughters in political life, can you? Mother smiled. I do not mind Sakaya and Rahab joining, she relented, but this child politician, referring to me, must stay home. I was the sacrificial lamb of the deal, but the right of women to participate was conceded. Since my sisters were allowed to participate in politics, it was inevitable that I should be allowed to eventually. In the meantime, I decided to continue my activities clandestinely. In 1959, however, when Mother discovered that I had become a fully fledged member of the A&M, she tried to forbid me from going to meetings. I couldn't very well offend her by flaunting my membership card. I told her that I was merely doing what I always did as a political supporter of the movement. But Mother remained unconvinced. On the night of a very important meeting, which I was determined to attend, I restored to subterfuge. I took a bath and put on my pajamas to convince Mother that I was not going anywhere that night. She must have thought that she had won the battle and that her child politician was recovering her senses. As 0 hour approached, I made my move, still in my pajamas. I went by Mother in the kitchen saying casually, I'm a little bored, Mother. I'm going to visit my girlfriend next door. She raised no objections. I headed directly to the meeting hall at the Solidarity Club. My pajama debut startled the members as I made my way to an empty seat. They were shaken by what they regarded as immoral behavior. I was blasted for violating Arab decorum and polite, womanly behavior. They were almost ready to pass a motion of censure and perhaps expulsion. Some of the reactionaries thought my appearance in pajamas was a tradition trampling, sex-enticing episode. Tradition trampling it might have been, sex-enticing it was not. I was terribly disturbed by their male chauvinism and self-righteousness. I stayed through the meeting and left still angry because my commitment to the cause was not appreciated and the personal difficulties I encountered at home were not taken into consideration. How could we liberate Palestine and the Arab homeland if we ourselves were not liberated? How could we advocate equality and keep over half the female, half the human race in bondage? That would be the next battle waged in the Sour Solidarity Club. Mother never found out about this escapade, but she soon reconciled herself to my vocation and acceded to my political demands. It took the A&M nearly a decade to start tapping into the full human reservoir of women. The school of the evangelical churches was not equipped to provide schooling for the secondary school bachelorettes or beyond. I had to go elsewhere to continue my education. The Sadia School for Girls was going to be my first opportunity to act completely on my own. I was excited by my newly won freedom as a young adult, but a little upset that school rules required that a student have 2 residential years to qualify for examination to the bachelorette. That meant I was going to lose one of the 2 years I had gained when I started school. I thought repeating the 5th secondary grade was no tragedy and rationalized it as a splendid opportunity to do great political work. By the autumn of 1960 was the year of the International Summit at the UN, not the year of great power rivalry or regional wars. Everything seemed quiet and conducive to reflective, prolonged study. President Nasir went to the UN. He looked tamed compared to 1956. Diplomacy seemed to have replaced revolution. The Third World was coming of age perhaps a little too soon. The only hotspot in Arab homeland was Algeria. I had to adjust to a new social and political environment after the turbulent years of Saur and await the coming of a revolutionary Messiah. He never came. Palestine needed one, but the Popular Front was not born until November of 1967. In Sadia, there was much time to spare and little action to engage in. Here, I was no longer in a completely Palestinian enclave. The school was highly apolitical, a graveyard for a revolutionary. I was placed in a house with 12 other girls. A few were Palestinians with whom I thought I could communicate, but to them, Palestine was in the distant and remote past. They wanted to obtain an quote-unquote education and find husbands. What a travesty of womanhood. I did not give up hope, however, and tried to accommodate myself to their mode of living. I was I was convivial by nature and loved to be with people, but I felt somewhat lonely in the midst of these 11 girls. I took heart when I noticed another lonely person. Her name was Miss McKnight, an American Black who had come all the way from America to teach in a private school in Sadia. I was a little startled at first until I learned the reason for her choice. In Lebanon, she was treated as a person and given the deference we accord teachers in the Arab world. In America, she was regarded as a colored woman, an inferior, perhaps even a sex object. Miss McKnight and I quickly became good friends. It was natural for two strange Black women in Sadia to pool their resources and offer each other aid and comfort. Miss McKnight was a darling of a woman, vivacious, always smiling, quick-witted, the model of a big sister for me. But our politics differed. She was surprised when I expressed deep hatred of the Jews and taught me not to make sweeping declarations. She pointed out that not all Jews are Zionists. Some were, in fact, anti-Zionist. I reflected on her distinctions and tried to adopt them into my thinking. The anniversaries of the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, and the Partition of Palestine, November 29, were approaching. The time came to test who stood where on my campus. I started to agitate for a general strike of schools, Saur style, to commemorate the anniversaries. In Saur, my school was always in the lead. We used to commence the marches and force all the other schools to close down and join in the demonstrations. It was not to be fulfilled in Saida. Miss McKnight appreciated the idea, but even she didn't like the idea of a general strike, the forced closing down of schools, the holding of massive public rallies, or the storming of police stations. She was a graduate of Martin Luther King's School of Nonviolence. She stood for prayer and the education of the enemy. I was a militant revolutionary who was born in the crucible of revolutionary upheaval. Despite our differences of opinion, Miss McKnight and I remained friends. As a member of an oppressed race, she was sympathetic to my cause. She used her influence to persuade the Lebanese Arab principal to let me hold in Arab soil a peaceful student rally in support of the Palestinian cause. The principal only agreed reluctantly, thinking she was doing a favor to her neighbors from Palestine. The rally, however, was postponed from November to May 15, 1961, the 13th anniversary of the Zionist state. Then I delivered my first public lecture on Palestine. I spoke of the history of Palestine and Zionism and my hopes for the future. Zionism as a political concept came to the fore at the turn of the 20th century. It was at the oust of a religious idea old Jews' pilgrimage to Jerusalem to spend their last days there and die in the Holy Land. Zionism as a word was coined in 1886 by Ben Archer, a European Jew who had never been to Palestine. It was Herzl who started the political side of Zionism in his pamphlet, The Jewish State. He was an Austrian, assimilated Jew who cared very little about Jewry prior to the 1880s. As a political correspondent covering the Dreyfus trial in Paris, he was converted to Zionism. He was appalled that France, the most civilized nation in Europe, was blatantly persecuting a fellow Jew and making him a scapegoat for a crime he never committed. Herzl felt that only in a Jewish state could the Jew become a quote-unquote normal person and lead a life of inner peace. He used all his energies and capitalist context to mobilize European Jewry and convene them at the first Zionist Congress in 1897 at Basel. His program was adopted and the World Zionist Organization was formed with Herzl as chairman. Herzl sought aid from Kaiser to realize his dream. He journeyed to Istanbul and sought the aid of the Sublime Porte. He told his prospective patrons that Jewish capital, knowledge, and skill would be placed at the disposal of Berlin and Istanbul if the Porte granted access to the Jews in the southern part of Arabia, Syria, and Palestine. But the Porte, fearing the reaction of his Arab subjects, was unable to confer such a title. Herzl was forced to look elsewhere for allies. He found one in Britain, the colonial power that occupied Egypt, the Sudan and Arab Gulf. He repeated his offer to the British and argued that a Jewish state would be a great bulwark against Arab revolution and a local sentinel to guard Britain's vital interests in the area, which included the Suez Canal and the trading routes to the Far East. From the very beginning, the idea of an Israeli state was sold to the Western powers as a wedge to keep the Arabs divided. The British appreciated the preferred co-optation of the international Jewish bourgeoisie and offered such land areas as the Argentine and Uganda where the Jews could settle. Although Herzl preferred a Jewish state in Palestine, he accepted the Uganda offer and sold it to his compatriots at the World Zionist Organization Congress of 1903. Shortly afterwards, Herzl died and the Uganda project was buried. Britain also offered Al-Arish in Egypt on the Mediterranean coast, the area nearest to Palestine, and that proposal was turned down by the Zionist diehards. In the autumn of 1971, Israel controlled not only the whole of Palestine, but also Al-Arish, Sinai, and the Golan Heights of Syria. Zionist colonies were set up in Palestine and thousands of Jews were filtered in because of the incompetence and corruption of the Ottoman administration. By 1917, when the Zionists extracted the Balfour Declaration from the British, the Jews constituted less than 10% of the population of the area. But the draftees of the Declaration and the temerity to refer to our people as the non-Jewish population, rather than referring to the Jews as a minority which could have religious rights in Palestine. The British were powerful and liked to have powerful friends with capital. The Zionists were prepared to pay any price, make any deal, offer every conceivable sacrifice, commit any crime to reach their goal. They did, and in 1948, Israel was established over the corpse of the Palestinian people. With the diplomatic support of the great powers, they were able to attain their objective quickly because Britain and France divided the Arab East among themselves into 7 states and imposed on the Arabs a so-called sacred trust of civilization under Western tutelage. Then the Allies suppressed the Arab national movement and crushed the revolutionary elements and launched the Great Arab Revolution of 1916. Much more significantly, Britain allowed the Zionists to establish dual power in Palestine and denied the same privilege to the Arabs. The cards were stacked in favor of Zionism. To undo this conspiracy, we revolted on a number of occasions against the mandate and Zionist colonization and fought for our national independence. But the enemy was in our ranks, and our own ruling class was finally responsible for our betrayal. In 1936, General Strike was a classic example in which the peasants and workers led the revolution and forced the upper class to join forces with them. They did, but only to abort and sacrifice the revolution on the altar of personal advantage. When the war of 1948 came, our ruling class had abandoned us to the wind. We were leaderless, dispersed, and on our own. The Zionists plucked the land from our hearts with little cost and less effort. The bankruptcy of our feudal leaders and the collapse of our social structure ushered in the age of the colonels' regimes that were progressive, reformist, Arabist. Meanwhile, the Zionists proceeded to establish a racist, exclusive society where Eastern European Zionists, Polish and Russian, dominated the government. Political parties, trade unions, bureaucracy, and business. Afro-Asian Jews were the target of discrimination, class exploitation, and European contempt. The Arab inhabitants, the rightful owners of Palestine, were placed under military administration and used along with the Arab Jews as a cheap labor supply. I concluded with a plea to free Palestine. Such a state of affairs cannot continue, and we must not allow it to continue. We can end it through Arab unity and the liberation of Palestine. Our goal can be reached if the UAR was expanded and all the Arab states become one nation state. We must fight for one Arab nation, for unity, for freedom, for socialism. We must defeat enemy number one, America, the supplier of Hawk missiles to Israel, and we must seize our own oil resources. We must learn to emulate our Algerian brethren in order to liberate Palestine. Long live Palestine, Arab and revolutionary. The students applauded heartily. They seemed to have been favorably impressed by my knowledge of Palestinian history and my commitment to unity. At that moment, neither I nor they foresaw the breakup of the UAR on September 28, 1961, when Syria withdrew, thereby dashing the Arab hope for unity and forcing the Palestinian people to re-examine their whole strategy of liberation. The breakup of the UAR was a temporary collapse of hope, and yet it also brought about the rise of a Palestinian revolutionism. Palestinian organizations of all sorts suddenly sprang up everywhere and mushroomed in the next 3 or 4 years. A new age dawned in the Arab East, while the Arab West inched its way to independence in Algeria through armed struggle. That spring, I obtained my secondary school bachelorate and went back to Saur for the summer, hoping to go to AUB in the autumn if I passed the entrance examinations. Saur was the vortex of nationalism that summer, and every conceivable question regarding the future of Arabism was raised and debated. The movement was in disarray, but we took heart because Nasir was building rockets and fleets. On July 23, 1962, Nasir celebrated the first decade of the Egyptian Revolution by displaying Egyptian-made rockets, ships, tanks, and planes. He announced to the world that Egyptian rockets would reach just to the south of Beirut. He and Amir saluted the parade and acted as if they were Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt combined. We were elated. Last of all of Israel was within the firing range of Arab rocketry. Nasir also declared that Egypt's fleet was the greatest in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we felt the time may have come to take a revenge even on Turkey for her butcheries of the First World War. In the summer of 1962, I once again had to face the problem of being a Palestinian Arab woman. My sisters in the West speak of 2 kinds of oppression, class and sexual. I had to face 4 kinds of oppression, national, social, the weight of traditions and habits, class, and sexual. At this point, I was particularly prone to oppression because I was a woman. My family professed equality like most modern families, but didn't practice it. Although I passed the bachelorette examination with flying colors and my brother Khaled failed, my family insisted on sending him to university instead. I was a very low priority item compared to my brothers. I was finally able to attend the American University of Beirut in 1962 to 63 due to the generosity of my brother Mohammed, who was working as an engineer in Kuwait. I scored the second highest average at the AUB entrance exam, 87%. Which should have entitled me to a scholarship, but for some reason or other, I was not given one. But I was delighted to have passed and wanted to enroll as quickly as possible before I got railroaded into some uncreative role like office work or marriage and baby production. When I arrived in Beirut in late August of 1962, my earthly possessions consisted of 50 Lebanese pounds. I thought I could register on the installment plan. The AUB registrar, however, didn't believe in that basic American principle. I did all I could to persuade him to let me register before my place was taken by someone else. I promised to pay the balance before the beginning of the academic year. He wouldn't budge. But a girl in the office sympathized with me. "How will you raise the balance for your fees, miss?" she asked. "I have a brother in Kuwait who promised to send me to university if I passed the examination, and I did." I was quick to explain. "Go and telegraph your brother," she instructed. I ran to downtown Beirut and telegraphed Muhammad. The cost was 12 pounds. I now had only 38 Lebanese pounds. I realized how quickly I could blow the money and end up penniless and unregistered. I waited and waited, and a whole day elapsed before word came that money was coming. I smiled to myself with satisfaction. My brother, like all good Arab men, honored his promises. I flew back to AUB and proudly presented the registrar with my fees. He uttered a few bureaucratic words and I was registered. At AUB, I enrolled in the 4 required freshman courses: chemistry, Arab literature, English, and math. Only one of my 4 professors was of Arabic origin, and I couldn't tell the difference between him and his 3 other fellow professors. They were all American in outlook, behavior, and manners. They were pseudo-Ivy Leaguers in a provincial school that only excelled in producing CIA spies and ministers. I don't know which was the lesser evil of the two. My annomial education was taking place at AUB. My real education was in the lecture hall at the Arab Cultural Club of Beirut in the ranks of the A&M. At the ACC, I became acquainted with distinguished Arab intellectuals such as Joseph Mogazil, the club's president, and Mohsen Ibrahim, the editor of Al-Hurray. Again, I apologize for mispronouncing those. The unofficial voice of the Arab nationalist movement. I also met Tazir Kalba, the president of the General Union of the Palestinian Students. The group of students and intellectuals I met in the academic year now occupy leadership roles in the Popular Front and the Arab left. AUB was an intellectual graveyard for me. It was a finishing school for the rich children of the Middle East and a social club for the colonial elite of the Arab world. Student government was banned, and the university was run like an American corporation. Students whose fees were not paid in full were often forbidden to attend classes. The only permissible activities on campus were dances, parties, and plays. No open political clubs were allowed. There were no demonstrations, no political rallies, no guest speakers. I lived at Jewett Hall, the women's residence, where I had an American roommate named Judy Sineker. Her social life never ceased to amaze me. One week, she had 3 different dates with 3 different men, and she kissed each of them with the same passion in the grand room at Jewett in front of a lot of other girls. I asked Judy how she could do it. She passed it off. It was all nice, clean American fun with no strings attached. I laughed and admired her for her amorality. But Judy and I were more than roommates. We were intellectual companions. She lectured me on American government, values, and social order, and I lectured her on the Arabs. She was a liberal Kennedy fan. I was a Nasser admirer. The test of our friendship came in October 1962, a decisive month in America and the Arab world. On October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy threatened to invade Cuba unless the Soviet missiles were dismantled and removed from Cuba. On October 2nd, the UAR had officially sent his troops to the Yemen to bolster the Republican regime, which had overthrown the medieval regime. Judy and I had long and heated dialogues concerning these events. The dialogues were mutually instructive, but neither of us convinced the other. Judy held that it was right for America to demand the removal of missiles from Cuba. The missiles she claimed constituted a strategic threat to her country's national security. I considered it criminal and barbarous on the part of the United States to threaten atomic holocaust unless it got its own way. Judy regarded the dispatching of UAR troops to Yemen as an invasion. I saw it as a moral obligation on the part of President Nasser, a noble gesture which he undertook to save the revolution from its corrupt enemies. She asserted that Nasser was an ambitious politician who sought to seize the Gulf oil and use it for his personal aggrandizement. And I countered that we had a right to that oil, and it should be used for the benefit of the Arab people. She saw Nasser's activity as part of a Soviet plot to occupy the Arab world. I explained to Judy that we were not fighting just to expel the colonial and neo-colonial powers from our region, only to offer our homeland on a silver plate to a new superpower. Judy was an imperial citizen, however liberal and idealistic she may have been. I was a Palestinian Arab woman without a homeland, living in exile, in an American colony in Ras Beirut. She had everything to lose. I had everything to gain. One's social consciousness is indeed determined by one's social conditions. Although politics were banned on campus, and GUPS, General Union of Palestinian Students, political activities were low-keyed, we engaged in confrontation politics in the spring of 1963. The proclamation of the Republic of Palestine, based in the city of Nablus, provided us with the occasion. Needless to say, Nablus, before and after the proclamation, remained under the firm control of King Hussein and his tribal soldiery. But there was a fair amount of agitation that reflected Palestinian dissatisfaction with Hussein, the Arab states, the general social condition. Moreover, new Palestinian organizations appeared on the scene, and by the autumn, the Arab states were forced to take notice and start talking about Palestinian unity. At AUB, we held demonstrations in support of Palestinian demands for a place under the sun. The administration initially turned a deaf ear to our activities, hoping that the spring offensive was a passing phenomenon. We were prompted to move quickly by the widespread accurate rumors that the Jordanian embassy had called in Palestinian students and threatened to cancel their Jordanian passports if they didn't cease their political agitation. We responded with more demonstrations, an action that gathered momentum rapidly, involving practically all the old politicos of Beirut and a significant proportion of foreign students. This was the first time that foreign students at AUB had rallied to the cause of the Palestinians since 1948, when President Doge had protested at the establishment of the State of Israel to President Harry Truman of the United States and had asked him for his post for it. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me read that again because it's important. So it says, when President Dodge had protested at the establishment of the State of Israel to President Harry Truman of the United States and had been axed, meaning fired, from his post for it, the university administration braced itself for counteraction. Amidst an atmosphere of high tension, GUPS proposed that a student committee be formed to represent Palestinian students before the Jordanian embassy. The committee was formed, and a number of prominent foreign students were elected to the committee. I was included in the group. The same day, we descended in full force on the Jordanian embassy and told the ambassador in no uncertain terms that we would slash his throat if he withdrew the passports. I did most of the talking, and my fellow students backed me to the hilt. Moments after our arrival, the embassy was surrounded by the Lebanese gendarmes, and a whole contingent of what appeared to be armed intelligence service officers stormed into our meeting office. The ambassador seemed to know exactly what was happening, although he claimed not to have called the police. In the presence of the whole committee, he had to eat his words and advise the police that we were not a gang of criminals, merely a committee of AUB students visiting His Excellency. The guards surveyed each one of us and left the room. I resumed the violent threats and insisted that we be given written assurances that passports wouldn't be canceled. The ambassador said that he was not instructed to give such assurances, but he was authorized to deny the report and give us his word of honor that such action was not contemplated. I sensed a feeling of victory and drank Arab coffee with the ambassador and assured him that we would be back if any action were taken against Palestinian students. Since we were talking in English and I was being so forceful, he presumed that I was not an Arab. Before we left, I spoke to him in Arabic and assured him that I was an Arab, a Palestinian, and that every Arab woman was going to be my kind of woman in the near future. He smiled paternally and bid us farewell. The same spring, I once again had to face the problem of being a woman. The A&M decided to train the first paramilitary contingent of university students. I was among the first to apply, and I couldn't be turned down on some flimsy excuse because of my revolutionary credentials and my long experience as an activist. Moreover, since I was on the executive committee of GUPS and a militant from AUB, they were afraid to turn me down. Instead, they tried to persuade me not to go because of the harshness of the weather, the physical fatigue, and the embarrassment my presence would cause. I assured them I was prepared to face and overcome all these difficulties. They finally agreed to let me go, and I underwent the necessary training. Hold on, let me grab some water. All right. Hopefully everyone is staying hydrated too and has access to clean drinking water. I'll continue. I was never revealed as a nationalist and a member of the underground to the students as a whole, but the administration was clever and they suspected that I was the torchbearer of nationalism at Gillette. I was called to the dean's office when I was seen publicly distributing literature relating to the 15th anniversary of Israel. The dean spoke to me in quick, angry, Americanized English, which I pretended not to understand. She was outraged that an AUB student couldn't speak English. She called in a secretary and asked her to act as an interpreter. The dean demanded, "Did you read the student handbook?" "Yes, I did," I replied through the interpreter. "Did you know that according to Article 6, you could be expelled for distributing political literature without permission?" "Yes," I said. "Why did you do it then?" I innocently replied that what I was distributing was not political literature at all. She took the pamphlet from the secretary's hand and read a few passages out loud. "Isn't this a political pamphlet that comes under Rule 6? I said I didn't know what a pamphlet was and that I didn't know what she was talking about anyway. The poor liberal dean started explaining to me that a political pamphlet was a statement that explained, defended, and advocated a political position. I agreed that her definition was excellent, but contended that it didn't apply in this case, because Palestine and her defense were natural and essential to me. "Palestine is not politics to me," I declared. "It is a question of life and death, and no one, certainly no Yankee, who can't even speak Arabic, can tell me how to act on the issue and how to fight for my country." The dean considered me a recalcitrant student who needed discipline, and she threatened to expel me. "I dare you to do so," I screamed in English and declared war on her as a CIA agent and on AUB as the servant of the Pentagon and oil cartels. "Yankee Dean, there will come a time when I will be sitting in your chair and I will expel all of your kind." I stormed out of her office shouting, "Long live Palestine, long live the A&M, and long live revolution." The dean was shocked, and I probably had to take a few tranquilizers before settling down to a day of bureaucratic business. In the spring of 1963, I passed my freshman year, although not with distinction. I hoped to return to university and continue my education, but money was not available, and I had to look for work. The temporary ending of my schooling made me look back on the value of my education in general. My academic education was on the whole meaningless. It taught me nothing of lasting value. The few sparks of life in these years were all related to the politics of revolution and were outside the curriculum. In the first 3 or 4 years of my education, I enjoyed reading history and literature. Towards the end of my student career, my interest shifted to mathematics and chemistry, and I began planning to specialize either in pharmacology or agriculture. Agriculture was vital because when we returned to Palestine, we would need to cultivate the land on a scientific basis and prove to the world that we could make better use of it than the Zionists. In the first 3 years of secondary school, I read about important figures: Lincoln, Napoleon, Hitler, Lenin. I admired them all in the beginning. At the moment, I admired Lincoln as a liberal in his time, Lenin as the greatest historic world individual, to be followed only by Mao, Ho, and Guevara. At first, I admired Hitler because I thought he was the enemy of the Jews. Later, I found out he classified Arabs as subhuman, only slightly above the Gypsies and the Jews. I admired Napoleon's military conquest and his ability to overcome all obstacles until I discovered that he did it all for personal glory. In literature, I read excerpts from Dickens and Shaw. I loved their work and once tried to imitate Shaw in an essay. The teachers didn't appreciate the effort, and the C+ was a powerful deterrent to further imitation. I dismissed Shakespeare as a pompous circumculturist. In Arab literature, I liked the poets of the I'm going to say this so wrong, and I apologize. Umayyad and Abbasid periods. Oh my God. That's all the education I remember. Since I had plenty of time to spare in 1960 to 61, I read Gandhi on my own. I liked his moral integrity, but I felt that he was born a slave and never transcended his slavery. As to personal and social relations, I led a normal, quote-unquote, life for an Arab girl. For 6 years, I liked a fellow Palestinian student of peasant background. At first, his careful avoidance of girls provoked my curiosity. Later, I discovered his dislike of women stemmed from watching his mother being raped by Israeli soldiers as they were fleeing from the Safad area in 1948. He abandoned his mother the moment he was able to subsist on his own. I haven't seen Adele since I went to AUB, and I wondered whether he is among our fighters or whether he's one of our martyrs. Perhaps he has abandoned hope altogether and is living in the slums of some Arab town. I've had casual boyfriends but never became really attached to any man. The older I grew, the more attached I became to the revolution. This is going to be section 3, Exile in Kuwait. In Kuwait, the Arab Gulf, every non-Kuwait is an alien except the British, the Americans, and their appendages. That's a quote from Atib Kurani. Arab nationalism was a 19th century idea. It was first propounded by literary elements and liberal writers who came in close contact with European thought and writers at British and French universities. Students and reformers were the first to espouse the nationalist ideas and organize Arab clubs. From the outset, Arab intellectuals were in the forefront. Arab soldiers and officers in the Ottoman armies joined the intellectuals at the turn of the century, particularly after the Ottomans launched their Turkification policy in the first decade of this century. In those days, nationalists did not have a clear conception of nationalism, nor did they have a defined framework encompassing all the Arab-speaking people. Nationalism was Eastern, not Western. That is, it included the Fertile Crescent states of West Asia, not North Africa. Indeed, some important figures such as al-Afghani, who advocated the Islamic Ba'ath, failed to distinguish between Arabism and Islam. His concept was strengthened by Western encroachments on the region and complicated by his advocacy of liberal democratic ideas within the Muslim world. Al-Afghani and his followers regarded the problem facing Islam as one of civilization and community. They thought that the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, 1798, and the subsequent takeovers of the Arab West by France and the occupation of Egypt by Britain were a repeat of the medieval wars of Islam and Christendom. To them, the answers were therefore clear. The Muslim world had to react as a community to withstand that onslaught and to defeat the West. Arab and Muslim were one. All Muslims had to act collectively. It took nearly 3 decades to jettison that mental albatross. Islam and Arabism were divorced and distinguished as 2 different concepts, rather than remaining as one and indivisible. The occasion for the separation was revealing. It left the Arabs breathless, defensive, bared. They knew how to react to the Christian West and how to face the latter's challenge by holy war. Now their co-religionists, the Turks, tried to Turkify the Arab East, which they had dominated from the 16th century until World War I. The Arab response was anguish, shock. They had to learn quickly that Muslims were not all brothers and that Turks were not all Arabs, and that the world was no longer run by religious bigots, but by capitalists. The states and parties seek alliances on the basis of mutual interest, not religious affiliations. The Arabs must alter their view of the world or remain subjugated. There was no specific party to cope with these issues, but there were individuals and groups based in Beirut, Cairo, and Damascus. There were also the nationalist officers in the Ottoman army who formed a part of the Young Turks. These officers were treated contemptuously by the rest of the Young Turks after the latter disclosed their intentions in 1908 and repudiated the idea of a decentralized empire based on national autonomy. Those officers, the intellectuals, and students constituted the cadres of the Great Arab Revolution in 1916. The net result of that revolution was the proclamation of Damascus-based Arabs. I'm sorry, I messed that up. Those officers, the intellectuals, and the students. The net result of that revolution was the proclamation of Damascus-based Arab state in 1920. The revolution and its leaders were rapidly suppressed and dispersed. The eastern part of the Arab world was dismembered and occupied by the British and French, who divided it among themselves in accordance with the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which allocated Lebanon and Syria to France and Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan to Britain. The secular Arab titles, the secular Arab nationalists were eliminated. The regionalists were bribed by state principalities and given kingly titles. The Hashemites and their hanger-ons carried the day by becoming palatable British tools, using religion and tribalism to perpetuate their power. The idea of nationalism alone survived as the Arab religion and tribalism, or as the Arab East was divided into spheres of influence between Britain and France. Palestine was conferred on the Zionists in the Balfour Declaration, and the Mandates regime did its utmost to realize the Zionist ideal. To infuse the idea of nationalism with socialist content required approximately half a century of turmoil and at least 3 major defeats for the prevailing feudal and petit bourgeois regimes. In each case, the Zionists triumphed while digging their own graves deeper. From 1920 to 1948, nationalists attempted to advance a secular liberal idea of nationalism. They failed dismally because both they and the feudal commercial ruling classes thought in terms of the Western capitalist analysis and tried to compete for Western favor. Both were imposed practically from above, and they were never able to incorporate the masses into their system. The secular nationalists, with their liberal beliefs, had the historic value of discrediting themselves and the Wafd Party of Egypt, unwittingly convincing the Arab people that the West was their inextricable enemy. In other words, the Arabs remained weak and divided, and the West was held responsible for their division and penury. It seemed, moreover, that the West never gave its clients an opportunity to develop a capitalist society in the Arab world, and the Arab rulers remained as remote from the people as their Ottoman predecessors. In this environment of weakness, Zionism was able to implant itself and deliver the coup de grace to Arab feudal mercantilism in 1948. As a result, a petty bourgeois nationalism arose and reflected itself in the first pan-Arab nationalist party, the Ba'ath, in social democratic movement. The Arab Ba'ath, formed between 1943 and 1947, as opposed to Islamic Ba'ath of yesteryear, was a significant development. It revitalized the idea of Arab nationalism and gave it a secular frame of reference. More importantly, however, the Ba'ath tied the idea of Arab unity with the concept of socialist humanism and placed socialism anew on the agenda of Arab nation. The slogans of Ba'ath were liberty, unity, socialism. Unfortunately for Ba'ath, it did not inherit the mantle of Arab revolution because its ideologies did not take into account the contradiction between liberal democracy and socialism, because they glossed over the relationship between socialism and mass mobilization and organization, and because the leadership preferred individualist theorizing and rulers to relevant social theory and mass work. Since Ba'ath was born on adolescent intellectual, it was unable to surmount that condition and interrogate itself in the society it purported to represent. In the 60s, its military leaders became I'm not sure what this word is. It's Putschist, Putschist, and incapable of relying on the masses. The colonels depended on their fellow colonels and the civilians on their tribal associations, the intellectuals on their salon audiences. Ba'ath became only a party in name in the 1970s, not a revolutionary instrument for the transformation of Arab society. I'm going to get some water. The number of nationalists Ba'ath lost in historic relevance in the late 1940s because Palestine was not its first priority and because it lacked understanding of revolutionary struggle and iron organization. This nationalist attempt to replace Ba'ath as the historic agent of Arab social change, and in 1948, they formed the Corps of Arab Martyrdom. Between 1952 and 1957, they were known as Arab Youth. In 1952, they called themselves the Arab Nationalist Movement. In 1967, they effectively ceased to exist. In 1970, the Arab Work Socialist Party succeeded the A&M as the Pan-Arab Party. The Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, which was formed in November 1967, replaced the Palestinian branch of the A&M, which had been set up in 1962. At the outset, The movement was a collection of sentimentalist rationalists nourished by the ideas of Satish al-Harsari, a writer who stressed the idea of nationality and based it on language and history only. In 1963, the movement was in a state of flux. Revolutionary radical nationalism was posed as the new alternative. The social question was becoming the focal point. It was this prospect and the intellectual and moral challenges it entailed that I pondered then as a member. The nuclei of the A&M was organized by a group of students and graduates from the American University of Beirut in the 1940s. The most important figures were Dr. George Habash, Dr. Wahid Hadid, and Hani el-Hindi, and Hamed el-Khatib. Again, I apologize for mispronouncing those. The initial cadres were mostly Palestinians who were appalled by the Arab disaster of 1948. The creation of the Zionist state gave the movement the necessary impetus for growth. The leaders were populist, anti-imperialist, ultra-nationalists. To them, nationalism and anti-imperialism were the principal preoccupation. Israel was the principal enemy. The Arab masses were the principal friend. Because of these political propositions, the young nationalists fought in the 1950s against entangling Western alliances, against the Hashemites in Jordan and Iraq, against Arab advocates of Western capitalist ideas. As the movement evolved, Nasser attained stardom in the firmament of the Third World by concluding the famous Sheikh's arm deal with the Soviet bloc and nationalizing Suez. The recognition of these achievements, the nationalists identified themselves with Nasserism. The A&M were natural allies, both believed in class collaboration and national unity. Both held ambiguous ideas regarding cooperative socialism. Both were elitist and statist in their conception of leadership and the role of the state in the economy. The only difference was that Nasser was in power and was unable to transcend his environment. The A&M was not in power, and in due course, it turned against those very oligarch ideas. Nasser was proud to react and manipulate leaders. On the other hand, was proud to manipulate pressures from East and West and boasted about being a pragmatist power wielder. The A&M leaders, on the other hand, were movement people. As such, they were more attuned than Nasser to the currents of modern thought and more capable of grasping and adapting to reality. In the mid-1960s, they became advocates of practitioners of armed struggle and scientific socialism. Nasser died in 1970, a soldier diplomat, not an advocate of people's wars. Meanwhile, during the period of close collaboration, contact between Nasser and the movement was maintained via such nationalist Syrian officers as Sharaj and the Egyptian political ideologue Abu al-Noor. The relationship was cordial but paternalistic. Direct contact was made for the first time on November 21st, 1961, when Hani al-Hindi, a Syrian radical member of the A&M, visited Nasser at the latter's request. Al-Hindi raised some fundamental issues with Nasser regarding the Syrian secession and the future prospects of Arab revolution. But by that time, Nasser's interest has shifted to Egyptian socialism. Dr. Habash, the Secretary General of the A&M, met Nasser on April 11, 1964, and was favorably impressed by Nasser's formidable personality and his ability to master issues and people. The exchange was in a period of expansive dimensions for Arab nationalism, and Nasser seemed to have recovered from the agony of the Syrian divorce. However, the meeting took place at a point when the roads to Jerusalem began to diverge radically and openly. Therefore, it may be important to underscore the fact that the A&M not only preceded Nasser and Nasserim in terms of time, but also it never became his permanent and supple tool, nor did it stop at Nasserism. We admit that the A&M was a staunch defender and ally of Nasserism in the stage of the national revolution, and we offer no apology for it. Moreover, the parting of ways, not the break with Nasser, came over the South Yemen question in the mid-60s. Here was a situation that Nasser tried to contain and keep under his grip. He helped organize and promote the Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, a group of British-oriented unionists and nationalists headed by Sanjak. The A&M, on the other hand, recognized its own South Yemen wing as the legitimate representative of the South Yemenis. Armed struggle commenced in the countryside and the peasants were converted to the revolution while Flossie was enjoying the limelight and the glare of Cairo and negotiating compromises with the British. Finally, the British were forced out and the People's Republic of South Yemen was proclaimed in November 1967. Within a few days, the bubble of Flossie was punctured and it passed from the scene. Nazirism was contracting and narrowing its horizons. The A&M revolutionism was replacing it by expanding its base and broadening its social views. In post-June War period, A&M revolutionism became the magnet of the Arab masses, the galvanizing force of the poor, the weak, and the wretched of the Arab world. In a nutshell, the question that posed itself was, who shall govern, the colonels or the people? We in the Arab Work Socialist Party say the people. That's why we contend that the revolution is coming. But that's why I became a full-time revolutionary. In the spring of 1963, Israel was 15 years old. Instead of rekindling the Arab spirit and resuming its historic mission after the breakup of the UAR, Nazirism was becoming inward-looking, repressive, managerial. Economically bourgeoisie, it became a spent force in historical terms. The Yemen intervention, October 1962, and the National Charter of May 1962 notwithstanding. Statesmanship, economic progress, political stability were touted as the hallmarks of the Egyptian regime. The UAR placed advertisements in the New York Times inviting monopolistic investors to share in its profitable state enterprises. Gone were the days when Nasser spoke and Western industries came to a halt for lack of oil. Gone were the days when Nasser spinned revolutionary slogans and the Arab masses seized and burned embassies. Gone were the days when Western prime ministers were treated like messenger boys and scoffed at in public. Yet in spite of this turnabout, we in the A&M remained Nasser supporters until 1967. The Nazarite social order consisted of a charter that promised a new UAR based on Islam, democracy, and cooperation, recognized the dominant role of the state in the economy, acknowledged the role of the national bourgeoisie, conferred on workers and peasants half of the parliamentary seats, granted employees an advisory role on the management of their fields, factories, offices, and pledged to give them financial rewards based on profits made. Nazirism was turning Egypt into a paradise of colonels, managers, and clerks. By 1965, the Hackleyan frankness told the Second Palestinian National Congress that he had no plan for the liberation of Palestine. Furthermore, Arab unity was revived in the spring of 1963 for about 3 months when Iraq, Egypt, and Syria agreed, April 17th, to form a new and revitalized United Arab Republic. The unity talks were held in Cairo after the Ba'athists, the junior partners of Nasser of the 1958 United Arab Republic period, seized power in Iraq, February 8th, and Syria, March 8th. To bolster their regimes, the Ba'athists called the Arab unity and for cooperation among the progressive forces. Nasser cannot ignore or oppose their call, lest he be considered an anti-unity man. After the proclamation of the new UAR, however, the Ba'athists returned to their capitals and began to purge the Nazarites and finally remove them from power completely. In early July, Nasser showed his displeasure by releasing the recorded tapes of the talks to Al-Ahram, the mouthpiece of the middle-class Egyptians. Heikel, the editor, serialized censored verbatim accounts and commented scathingly on the Ba'ath, thereby signaling to the world that Nasser had no intention of proceeding with the autumn merger as scheduled. The disclosures demonstrated 2 facts. First, that Nasser was unwilling to regard anyone as his equal or subordinate Egyptian nationalist interests to the common Arab good, and secondly, that the Ba'athists were insincere, mistrusted Nasser, and viewed themselves as the successors to a dying Nazirism. In the ensuing years, Ba'athism too became a regime of colonels. This and other semi-fictional incidences puzzled, bewildered, and confused the A&M. By the spring of 1963, I realized I would not be able to return to AUB in the autumn. I had to make a decision. There were few work prospects to explore. There were none in Lebanon. I was 19 years old, and I was not looking for a husband to serve. I couldn't stay at home and vegetate. In that confusing spring, a family incident led me to seek refuge outside of Lebanon. For 15 years, my family had been exiled from our beloved homeland. Since a state of war existed between the Arab states and Israel, we had not seen a single relative from Haifa or Majdal el-Karam. Travel restrictions were too severe. Bureaucratic red tape was overwhelming, and financial considerations were difficult to overcome. However, after prolonged and careful preparation, my father went to see his family in Jerusalem at the Mandelbaum Gate. He waited for 3 days, but no one showed up. A few weeks later, a meeting was again arranged, but this time my father was paralyzed and not able to go. Mother went without him. The meeting was a nightmare of barbed wire. When grandmother saw mother, she presumed her son must have died, and she collapsed. My aunts, my cousins, and mother carried on a teary dialogue for about an hour. Little or nothing was said beyond conveying greetings of fleeting reminiscence. We were all drenched with tears. We looked at each other, wondering whether reunion would ever be possible. No one could utter a coherent sentence. We parted infuriated at the Zionist overlord. As mother said adieu to grandmother, Granny placed her necklace around mother's neck and kissed her. An Israeli guard looked on and instantly pounced on mother and snatched the necklace from her chest. Mother fought back, but the man with the gun prevailed. She returned home upset by Arab inability to protect her and shocked by Zionist brutality. Such events kept my family and most Palestinians away from the Zionists. Since then, we have not seen our relatives, and father died without having seen his mother and sisters for 18 years. What was I to do in the midst of this situation? Where was I to go? I couldn't bend heaven, and I would scratch hell. Kuwait was the only outlet. There was no other possibility. In the summer of 1963, the voice of the Arabs being broadcast from Cairo to the four corners of the globe, and the press of the Arab world was filled with the idea of the Palestine entity. Innumerable Palestinians, including myself, were attracted to the idea, if not to the organization that was intended as its embodiment. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. PLO was set up by the Arab League states in January 1964. The PLO was launched by the Arab League to contain the Palestinians while supposedly giving them an instrument of liberation. At the time, only a few prospective people saw Arab symmetry for what it was. Those who foresaw had no power. Arab presidents and kings met in the splendor of Cairo, and although they decided not to confront Israel, they led their people into believing that they were preparing for an eventuality of war. They issued joint military commands that had no power. Weeks later, they blamed their failure on Lebanon for allegedly not allowing Arab troops to occupy strategic positions on its soil, as if Syria and Jordan had agreed to the proposal and implemented it, and as if Lebanon had remained the only obstacle. They had allocated the astronomical sum of $13 million to divert the waters of the Jordan, yet such a sum wouldn't be enough to dig a ditch. They created the PLO as a crumb to the Palestinians, and the faithful believed in the good faith of the leadership. All was a sham, as the disasters in June were unmistakably to show. The PLO was born crippled, if not dead, and the Arab states neither allowed the Palestinians to act independently, nor did they themselves act with sufficient vigor to safeguard Palestinian interests. The PLO consisted of the remnants of a dead social class, and its leaders were given their positions in recognition of their loyalties to the various summit conferences. The PLO was a skeleton, put on display at the Arab League headquarters. It was neither a revolutionary spearhead to lead the struggle for the liberation of Palestine, nor a rallying point for the dispersed masses of refugees. In late September 1963, I departed for Kuwait with mixed feelings and without prospect of employment. For 3 months, I was without work. waiting for a reply to my application from the Kuwait Ministry of Education. At last, I received word in mid-December that a position was available in Al-Jarrah, some 50 kilometers from Kuwait City, the capital of Kuwaiti state, where my brother Muhammad lived. During the intervening 3 months, I thought about the world situation and pondered the meaning of life, especially after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22nd. I do not know why the Kennedy assassination affected me emotionally. Kennedy was the president of a state that helped perpetuate my exile, a state that maintained and advanced the Zionist cause I hated. Kennedy was a sophisticated partisan, a class enemy, and he had given key posts in his regime to at least 3 dedicated Zionist Jews. He also approved the invasion of Cuba in April 1961 by a pack of America-supported mercenaries. Yet I, the hardened Palestinian revolutionary, for some inexplicable reason, cried when I heard the news. I watched the funeral on TV and saw Americans weep. Until then, I had thought of the United States as a nation of monsters and scoundrels capable of perpetuating every conceivable crime. I received my view slightly, but I revised my view slightly. But Lyndon Johnson's rapacity? Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. And Nixon's hypocrisy had enforced their original image. I wept for Kennedy, perhaps because I somehow identified with the youth of America that loved and admired him dearly. Perhaps I may have believed, as some Arabs did, that Kennedy was indeed going to work for the restoration of Palestinian rights, as the Kennedy-Nasser correspondence later illustrated. I suspect that my tears were a natural human reaction. My prejudices couldn't stop them until it was too late. I'm not sorry, I cried. Al-Jarrah, for a girl from AUB and the political mill of Beirut, was the city of eternal boredom. We were all foreigners in the eyes of the Kuwaiti Arab government, though every one of us came from the Arab world. The only colorful aspect of the school was the multitude of foreigners' dialects spoken. The Egyptians, Palestinians, and Syrians were the largest group. This was the first time I had come into close contact with Egyptians. The Syrians were the same as the Palestinians, with the exception of the lady principal, Saud, who excelled as an obsessive bureaucrat and an arbitrary woman. She was, to put it mildly, an administrator who prostrated herself before the Ministry of Education and set out to discipline her fellow teachers by a network of informers. Matters were complicated for me because I had no conception of rules or roles. I knew of no distinctions between governors and governed. I had no idea of bureaucratic memos and no notion of external authority. The only authority I had ever recognized since I left home in 1960 was that of the Comrade Regional Commander. My world was turned upside down. My colleagues either delighted in my agony, resented me as a proof of their cowardice, or secretly admired my rebellion. They were serfs who trembled before the knight and paid him homage. At Al-Jarrah, let me grab some water. At Al-Jarrah, we could not leave campus without special permission during the week. On Thursday evenings, we could visit relatives or immediate family members and stay overnight. There were no cinemas to visit, no boyfriends to pass the time with, no British museum to study in. Overt political activity was forbidden. We were truly family eunuchs in an Oriental dystopic order. I recall distinctly the famous short sleeves episode when I opposed the authorities. The principal had threatened to expel me for appearing in short sleeves, which were banned in Kuwait despite the sweltering heat. I challenged her, and then to expose my body further. She was infuriated, but was unable to carry out her threat. I informed her that I would help her write a memo on my scandalous behavior to the Ministry of Education if she persisted in observing that ridiculous rule. She had to swallow her pride and wrote a memo recommending my transfer elsewhere at the end of the academic year. I exulted at the prospect, though I would regret the loss of the few friends I had made at Al-Jarrah. The children at Al-Jarrah manifested the cultural deprivation of a rural and remote Bedouin people, but they were intelligent and quickly absorbed information. Our school was the only window they had to the outside world. They needed to be taught the rudiments of living in their rapidly developing community and warned about urban slavery. Instead, I was teaching them English and science. But I used every possible opportunity to propagate my political cause. The pupils were susceptible and responded positively. I did not reveal my association with the A&M. It would have been political suicide. The lady principal would have been delighted to invoke her powers. Instead, I injected my political virus in small doses. I related every issue to the world around us and whenever possible to the Palestinian question. Some pupils listened attentively. Others patted their goats, sheep, or cows, or fed their chickens through the school windows. Their parents were not keenly aware of what was going on. They thought the teacher knew best, and they in no way interfered with my work. The world of Al-Jarar had its good points. It was not all unpleasantness, particularly for those not politically inclined. Spring came and found the Arab governments making noises about Israel stealing Arab waters from the Jordan River. They ostensibly made their own preparations to divert the river 10 years ago too late. 10 years too late. No military attempt to stop the Israeli was made. A few minor border incidents occurred and the Arab thundered revenge. The farce went on for a year or so. Israel freely carried out her diversion project and expropriated almost all the waters of the Jordan River. Meanwhile, the honorable president and noble kings, without consulting the Palestinian people or considering other candidates, appointed Ahmed Shikari chairman of the PLO. Shikari was their man. He could be relied upon to make the necessary flamboyant pronouncements to appease the Palestinian masses without precipitating a crisis or organizing the Palestinians into a fighting force. The PLO leadership was imposed from above. It was accountable to the powers above, not to the Palestinian people whom it sought to represent. Shikari was touring in the Arab world, and he came to Kuwait to mobilize the Palestinians and get them to participate in a constituent assembly to elect a Palestinian parliament. In Kuwait, Shikari contacted the people he knew, the former upper class of Palestinians, who now held the lower echelon position in Kuwait as engineers or managers of small business enterprises. The children of the refugees, the school teachers, the skilled, semi-skilled, and manual workers were not contacted. They were merely expected to applaud the wise decisions of the Arab leaders and rubber stamp the election of their representative, all in quotes, chosen from the better people. Moreover, since the Palestinians in Kuwait and throughout the Arab Gulf were permitted no organic community or viable organizations, it was very difficult accurately to determine communal feelings. The situation enabled certain self-seeking, self-appointed individuals to represent, quote-unquote, the Palestinians. In spite of all these difficulties and my own misgivings, I agitated on our campus, urging Palestinians to take an active part in forming branches for the PLO. But no branches were formed at all at Al-Jarar because too many people were skeptical. I shared their skepticism, but I thought the PLO was better than nothing at all since the Kuwait government recognized it as an official representative of the Palestinians and agreed to let Palestinians join it as long as they remained outside the Kuwait political arena. My principal had received no directive to encourage such a club, and she decided the rule banning politics still applied and called me to her office to ask me to cease my activities. She argued that I was a Lebanese. I held a Lebanese passport and had nothing to do with Palestine. I listened to her monologue without interrupting. When she finished, I stood up. Woman principal, your kind of obedient, amoral, apolitical people were responsible for the loss of Palestine. Your kind of careerists have oppressed the Palestinians more effectively than the Zionists have. Your graveyard-like school has stunted the growth of intelligence. You are a part of the enemy camp. I believe if we don't overthrow your masters and your servile type, more tragedy and destruction will plague the Arab homeland. I believe you're more dangerous than the acknowledged foe. Let us suppose that I am only a Lebanese citizen. Does that nationality absolve me of my Arab obligations? Does it erase my Arab identity? Does it mean that I am not an Arab woman? Principal, I am Arab. I am Palestinian. I am a Lebanese Arab who is going to proselytize the Arab cause here on your campus and everywhere. No force other than death can stop me. Act as you see fit. I shall not relent. I shall not be cowed. I shall not retreat. Good day. I walked out and slammed the door. I had made my last appearance in her office. On May 28, 1964, the Palestine National Congress was opened in Jerusalem by King Hussein. Its 350 delegates represented a cross-section of the Palestinian people with traditionalists in the majority. A number of prominent quote-unquote radicals were barred from the Congress by the Jordanian authorities. The Congress elected an executive committee of 7, reconfirmed Ahmad Shakuri as chairman, issued a manifesto, the National Charter, which embodied the ideology of our bankrupt ruling classes, and elected all sorts of high-sounding state committees to man the apparatus of the forthcoming revolution. The PLO occupied the Palestinian seat at the Arab League headquarters in Cairo. Arab symmetry continued in the autumn of 1964. Within a year, the leaders themselves had stopped believing their own lies. Through their media agents, continued to expound the plans in purple prose and poetic visions. In late June of 1964, I returned to Lebanon for what during the next 6 years became an annual furlough. In Lebanon, I rethreaded my way back to the underground and felt a sense of relief after the isolation of Al-Jarrah and the enervating heat of Kuwait. I observed that cracks were opening up within the citadel of the Arab nationalist movement in Beirut. However, these profound differences within the movement were frozen in the name of unity, good statesmanship, and personal relationships. Serious differences regarding ideology, strategy, organization, and personality erupted again and again until a former split was final to take place in 5 years' time. As autumn approached, I made plans to return to Kuwait. Once again, I had to live in the barracks rather than with my brother. For a woman, living alone in Kuwait was simply unthinkable. At the Shahab school, I discovered that I had been demoted from the intermediate to the elementary level of teaching. I was confined to teaching grade 2 for the next 5 years and was thus deprived of my adolescent audience and the possibility of using my classroom as a political platform. Dismayed and annoyed at first, I reconciled myself quickly. There was nothing I could do to alter my teaching status. Resignation was a worse alternative since it meant being on the unemployment heap with a substantial number of other Arab workers. My pupils were an enjoyable lot. Many of them were of Iranian origin. Their parents had immigrated to Kuwait in pursuit of work. The Shahab school was populated with working-class children who were anxious to learn and willing to do their homework. They were tireless children who could have out-traced baby camels given the opportunity. They were a delight to be with, but they were not important as political converts. Here, I had the opportunity to say anything in the classroom without feeling Big Brother was watching. The problem was to learn how to communicate with 7- and 8-year-olds and what to expect from them. I decided it would be best not to expect anything more than the mastery of a few central Palestinian issues such as the Balfour Declaration, the partition of Palestine, and the creation of Zionist Israel. At the faculty level, there was little tension and no clashes with the principal or any other colleagues. From 1968 on, the principal and a large number of teachers supported the Fatah. Those of us who supported the Popular Front had no difficulty coexisting with them. But though the atmosphere was conducive to dialogue and hospitable to liberal democratic ideas, I never publicly revealed my true political affiliations. I was also helped because I had learned the rudiments of being a teacher and thus staved off confrontations with bossy administrations. Kuwait City was a cosmopolitan center compared with Al-Jarrah. We were not village-bound. I visited my brother and his wife and children at weekends. At Mohammed's, I kept in tenuous contact with the A&M, though the movement was prescribed and highly disorganized. We were closer to civilization here, yet worlds apart from the hustle and bustle of the Beirut and its intellectual saloons and fashionable streets. The people seemed more mellow, and there was no political life even of the right-wing variety. For me, It was a period of intellectual incubation and reflection, but not stagnation. There was ample time to study, think, contemplate, plan. Most of my colleagues had a hedonistic lifestyle, trying to boost their morale by conspicuously acquiring and consuming more goods. Some sent their parents a pair of proportion of their salaries and led an abstemious kind of life. I was politically conscious and a chain smoker. I needed no diversions. On January 1st, 1965, Fatah opened a new era in modern Palestinian history. This is generally recognized as the date of the modern Palestinian Revolution. Armed struggle. Long the talk of, or armed struggle, long the talk of the saloons and work of individuals and small groups was now translated into action in daily forays into the homeland. The A&M, of course, had been reconnaissance work since 1953 and infiltrating its Fedayeen or commandos into occupied Palestine since 1955. The golden era of Fedayeen activities was in the mid-1950s, when the Fedayeen used a roam to occupy territories at will. Although the Egyptian government had a role in financing and training the commandos, all missions were conducted by Palestinians who knew the cities and the countryside well. Their excursions proved so formidable that Israel used them in 1956 as a pretext to ally with the British and French in a tripartite invasion of Suez. After the settlement of 1957 and withdrawal of foreign troops from Egypt, Nasir banned guerrilla activities, and for 11 years, not a single shot was exchanged across the borders with Israel. Egypt administered Gaza behind the UN shield, and the Arab states seemed to act as Israel's sentinels for the next decade, and they too discouraged guerrilla operations. The autumn of 1964 activities were revived. The PLO proved to be no panacea. The Arab leaders gradually went back on their liberation pledges. The UAR-US relations were deteriorating and gradually went back, deteriorating, and President Johnson, was threatening to cut the sales of wheat to Egypt. The Syrian Baptists fell under siege from the UAR and Iraq and encouraged activities that embarrassed Nasir. The Palestinian siege from the Palestinian people were disillusioned with their Arab brethren. All these factors led to new vitality that surfaced in Palestinian ranks. The climate of opinion favored doing something. The key Arab leader, Nasir, was running into difficulties with the United States, which meant he could support the resistance to bring pressure on Israel and thus improve his bargaining position with America. Nasir usually knew how to manipulate power to his advantage. Interestingly enough, Nasir did not anticipate the impeding appearance of Fatah. He must have thought the PLO would be a replica of the Fahadin movement of the mid-50s. The new groups that were emerging and eclipsing the PLO were not under Arab League control. The Heroes of Return, Avenging Youth, and Fatah were a different generation of revolutionaries, autonomous groups, not the hirelings of Arab regimes. They expressed the rise of an independent Palestine and asserted that the right of Palestinians to self-determination. At first, Fatah was ignored. Later, it was accused of being a Scinto agent and even labeled as a right-wing Muslim Brotherhood underground. The more that crimes were attributed to Fatah, the more the Palestinians rallied behind it. The more Fatahites Hussein killed, the more Palestinians joined, the more Palestinians joined Fatah. The more bureaucratic and upper class that PLO became, the more appealing armed struggle became. The new movement provided a spark of hope. Armed struggle was the way to salvation. As a Palestinian, I had to believe in the gun as an embodiment of my humanity and my determination to liberate myself and my fellow men. Every single respecting Palestinian had to become a revolutionary. The news of revolutionary activity filtered slowly into Kuwait, either by word of mouth, still the most effective means of communication in the Arab world, or by filling Beirut and Syrian papers. Hold on real quick. Okay. All right. The news of revolutionary activity filtered slowly into Kuwait, either by word of mouth, still the most effective means of communication in the Arab world, or by friendly Beirut or Syrian papers. The Iraqi, Egyptian, and Jordanian papers reserved their spaces for contemptuous remark and accusations against right-wing radicals who did not see it the Arif Hikal Hussein way. With the cessation of American wheat sales to the UAR in 1966, President Nasser started to look upon Fatah more favorably, particularly after Hussein blocked all PLO attempts to organize and station Palestinian Liberation Army troops on Jordanian territory. As Arab leaders repudiated their summit pledges, they began to fall out among themselves, each blaming the other for not carrying out the resolutions. Nasser supported Fatah because he shared its objectives, not because he was suddenly converted to the cause of people's war and armed struggle. In this context, Nasser divided the Arab world into progressives and reactionaries, proclaiming himself leader of the progressives. The Saudis, at the instigation of Washington, decided to propagate the cause of Islam against the menace of communism, and King Faisal became the leading proponent of the Islamic Pact, designed to include all Islamic states and tie them to Washington. The Yemeni civil war was concluded in the autumn of 1967 after 5 years of revolution. The Yemeni radicals were sacrificed at Khartoum, August 29th to September 1st, in the name of Arab solidarity and in honor of financial subsidies to Nasser and Hussein from the oil kings. Egypt's 50,000 troops were withdrawn, and the Yemen were abandoned to the winds of conservatism and counter-revolution. The Palestinian people had spent 17 years in exile, living on hopes fostered by the Arab leadership. In 1965, they decided they must liberate themselves rather than wait for God's help. Fatah began to occupy a central role in our lives despite its many defects and problems. Its supreme virtue, however, was inconceivable. It was a fighting organization in a time when others only talked about the theories of war. It was created by Palestinians to take up armed struggle. Some did. I was not yet ready. In 1965, my political interest broadened considerably, and thanks to a cowboy from Texas, Lyndon Johnson, I was forced to learn a good deal about Vietnam and Latin America. Next to the Algerians, the Vietnamese were a great source of inspiration to me. Here was a small nation in black pajamas fighting the mightiest empire in world history and defeating it. As Johnson intensified his bombing attacks and as his generals promised him victory if only more tons of bombs were dropped on Vietnam, I became angrier and angrier with myself for not being able to do anything to protest or undermine American savagery. The people of Vietnam stood up to the B-52 bombers though their land was pulverized and practically every square foot of it became a part of an American-made crater. Here was a people with an indomitable spirit, a people whose heroic deeds placed them among the gods. Here was a people whose unbound humanity was a blessing to mankind. The Palestinians must learn the secrets of the Vietnamese: devotion to the cause, sacrifice to fatherland, absolute commitment to the community, a revolutionary party with a clear conception of ideology, strategy, organization. We could do it. We had to do it, unless we wished to remain contemptible refugees. I hated the American government, and I hated it more when I saw Adlai Stevenson in April of 1965 defending the invasion of the Dominican Republic. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the liberal hero of Eisenhower era brandishing the names of 57 communists who were members of Colonel Francisco Camafuio's insurgent army. Y'all be butchering these names. I'm sorry. 20,000 U.S. troops were dispatched into Santo Domingo to safeguard American life and property, a euphemism which provided a pretext to overthrow the revolutionary government. I almost died laughing when I heard on a BBC broadcast that the Christian Science Monitor checked on the 57 communists and found that the most were either dead, in prison, or in exile. The American troops, quote unquote, liberated the island a quote-unquote free election was held, and the good people, quote-unquote, elected a land aristocratic government led by Mr. Balaguer. All this was done, of course, in loyal homage to liberalism, to the new frontiers, to the good society and the American dream. I understood the direct invasion of Vietnam and the Dominican Republic to be a prelude to the return of the age of gunboat diplomacy, which would soon stretch to the Middle East. I could not predict when the United States or its local power would make a move in our area. It seemed the USA was everywhere on the offensive as the Soviet leadership preached coexistence and tried to practice Dente. From Brazil to Vietnam, from Dominican Republic to Algeria, from Mali to Indonesia, from Bolivia to Greece, U.S. fleets, Air Force, and intelligence networks were undermining the achievements of the post-war period and arresting the tide of history. The 1960s were indeed America's decade. The 1970s shall be the decade of its dismantlement and complete undoing. The year 1966 was the year of personal mourning for me. Father died after a 4-year illness, and I deeply felt the loss of his gentle presence. The autumn, almost every teacher on the staff was wearing black for family losses. All of us were unhappy. And to add to my personal unhappiness, the Kuwaiti government expelled my brother Muhammad for political activities, and Israel started anew its provocative policy of massive retaliation. The Zionists were aware of Nasir's weakness and decided to test Arab will by using Fatah's raids on the occupied territory as a pretext to attack Jordan. In November, the Israelis launched a murderous and punishing assault on Es Samu. The whole town was demolished, and dozens of its inhabitants were killed or injured. Arab military response was zero. The Arab Joint Command was a dead letter. The Arabs merely went to the UN and obtained another censure of Israel with America's approval. A few months later, in April 1967, Syria's alliance with Nasir was also tested. On April 7th, the Israelis downed Syrian jet fighters while Egyptian MiGs looked on, wings folded. The audacious Israelis did not stop there. They knew more than we did. They challenged Nasir in May, and he fell for their trap. In 1 week in June, the Egyptian army was slaughtered, its armor converted into scrap metal, its quote-unquote supremacy in the East was shattered. All the illusions of the Arab nationalists were exploded in 2 hours and 50 minutes. The time it took the Israeli war force to pulverize the Egyptian Air Force on the ground on June 5th, 1967. A whole era ended. A social class had failed to safeguard Arab interests through stupidity. Arab soldiery lost its moral credibility, and Nazirism, if not Nasir, was dead. Expecting Arab victory, I refused to believe the outcome. I did believe it when Nasir offered his resignation on June 9th, 1967. I awoke from my dream. I smashed my radio and went into a prolonged period of silence. My whole world collapsed. It seemed every Arab had become a slave. The travel reservations that I made to return to Palestine to celebrate the recovery of the homeland were canceled. I had no desire to go to Beirut. I felt catatonic for a month. Then I decided to go to Lebanon to find out what was happening. My brother, Walid, My brother Walid brought me up to date on recent developments within the A&M. In the autumn, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine was born. Here is a summary of the events that occurred in the spring of 1967. May 12th, 1967, Premier Eshkol and his generals threatened to march to Damascus to topple the Ba'athist ruling Democratic Party of Syria, hotheads. On May 14th, Soviet and Egyptian intelligence reported a missing Israeli troops on the Syrian borders. General Armour proposed a preemptive attack on the 19th anniversary of Israel. Nasir vetoed him. On May 17th, Nasir ordered the UN emergency forces to withdraw. They did within 2 days. On May 18th and 19th, Nasir paraded his battle-dressed troops in front of the Western embassies in Cairo and their way to Sinai. On May 22nd, 11 years after the Suez War, Nasir reoccupied Sharm el-Sheikh and declared a blockade of Israeli shipping. Nasir was calling all the shots. He dared all enemies. I was elated as the Israelis fumbled, apparently in a state of confusion and irresolution. On May 26, the ambassadors of the two superpowers, the Soviet and the American, visited Nasir, assuring him that if he did not start the shooting, the Israelis wouldn't. The maritime nations were making noises and plans under United States auspices. They didn't move. Nasir seemed to be firmly in the saddle. Hussein rushed to Cairo to pay homage and sign an alliance with Nasir, hoping to cash in on the spoils of war. Nasir called the press of the world and in one of his last speeches declared to Israel, Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome. We are ready, come and fight. On June 2nd, 1967, 3 days before the Israelis attacked, Nasir was informed by friends that the Israelis were going to attack on the morning of June 5th. All of us thought that the march to Haifa and Tel Aviv was at most a few weeks' affair. As it turned out, the march to Suez was a 6-day endeavor. Meanwhile, the Israelis struck first, and the UAR Eagles never took off the ground. The Air Force was turned into rubble as the pilots celebrated the birthday of the Admiral's daughter, although an alert had been on for 3 days. On June 5th, 6th, and 7th, Radio Cairo and the press announced the shooting down of hundreds of Israeli planes, the captures of cities, and Arab victory. We hailed Arab victory. On the 8th of June, silence prevailed. We knew instantly that something was wrong. At the UN and the UAR accepted a ceasefire order, and on the 9th, Nasir resigned. The UAR had capitulated, and the tide was turned in favor of Israel. The dream ended. As the protagonists broadcast their war signals from Cairo, Tel Aviv, and other capitals in Kuwait, we demonstrated in favor of Arab unity and one unified command. Along with others who had some nursing training offered to go to the front, we were turned down. Those of us who smoked Western cigarettes suddenly threw them away. In May, the city of Kuwait truly felt the short spring of the Arab nation. We were overwhelmed by our own illusions when we learned that even little Kuwait was dispatching forces to guard the Arab ramparts and participate in the battle of destiny. On June 5th, the day of reckoning, all teachers went to hospitals to donate blood. For a whole month, I've been listening to the news on the hour. Now was the final hour. Was it to be victory or defeat? It was defeat, on a scale much more catastrophic than the Israelis ever dared imagine. Nasir resigned. The masses restored him to power. He lived for 3 more years. The summer of 1967 was uneventful. All hope was gone. Little or nothing occurred to rebuild my confidence. I returned to Kuwait with my colleagues. Those whose families were in the West Bank came back with horrifying stories. The stories had a great impact on each one of us. Details about Zionist atrocities abounded. There were the usual stories of rape, arson, theft. There were the heart-rending accounts of people napalmed from the air, burned to death or surviving with their whole body scarred. There was a story of a mother who cried to wet the tongue of her dying infant. The more tales I heard, the more hatred crystallized. I met a lady from Kalkala who described to me how the border town was leveled and how other Arab towns were demolished. I listened intently to all stories. The experience shattered me. Nothing now could avenge Arab honor or liberate the occupied territories. All the diplomatic moves and maneuvers and the summits and the counter-summits and the eloquent speeches did not make one iota of difference. All the work I did for the Red Crescent and the funds I contributed and collected seemed minuscule. On November 22nd, the UN Security Council, with Arab approval, sanctioned Israel's permanent conquest of my home in Palestine. The UN conferred on Israel the right to use international waterways and the right to recognition with secure and recognized borders. In return for the settlement of the refugee problem and withdrawal to June 4th borders, Israel insisted on total Arab capitulation. To add to my despair, on October 9th, Che Guevara, my hero, was assassinated by CIA-trained Bolivian Rangers. The June War shattered my existence, barred my essence. The assassination of Guevara pricked my conscience. Here was an Argentinian radical who had fought beside Fidel Castro in Cuba and helped the revolution attain power on January 1st, 1959. His stature in the next 8 years assumed international proportions. His personality almost rivaled that of Fidel's. Che sacrificed his personal career as Minister of Industry when his views and those of Fidel clashed. Instead of making his differences with Fidel a public issue and undermining the revolution in Cuba, he decided to look for a new homeland for revolutionary action.